I'm Melody Grant, 34, and 3 months ago, I lost everything that mattered, my husband Christopher to a sudden heart attack, and with him, the life we'd built together. But losing my husband wasn't enough for his family. 2 weeks after the funeral, my mother-in-law came to my door with papers to kick me out. Her cold smile hurt more than her words. "This house belongs to the family now, dear. Time to pack up and move on." She thought I was just the sad widow with nowhere to go. She thought Christopher had left me weak and helpless. But what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was the talk Christopher and I had late one night 5 years ago, and the choice that would change everything. Sometimes the people who think you're nothing are the ones who learn the biggest lessons about who really has the power. If you've ever felt looked down on by people who should have helped you, like and subscribe for more stories like this. It started like any other Tuesday morning. Christopher was making coffee while I packed my lunch for work. He'd been complaining about chest pains the night before, but he brushed off my concerns with his usual "I'm fine, honey," and that smile. That always made me believe him. I was grabbing my keys when I heard the crash. The coffee mug shattered against the kitchen floor, and Christopher was on his knees, clutching his chest. His face had gone gray, and his breathing came in short, desperate gasps. "Call 911, he whispered, and those were the last coherent words my husband ever spoke to me. The paramedics worked on him for 23 minutes in our kitchen. I know because I watched the clock above the stove, counting every second, praying that time would somehow reverse itself. They got his heart beating again, barely, and rushed him to the hospital with me following in my car, my hands shaking so badly I could barely steer. At the hospital, doctors swarmed around him while I sat in a plastic chair, still wearing my work clothes, still holding my purse like I might need to pay for something that would fix this. The cardiologist, Dr. Martinez, finally came out after what felt like hours but was probably only 90 minutes. "Mrs. Grant, I'm sorry. Your husband suffered a massive heart attack. We did everything we could, but the damage was too extensive." The death certificate would later list the cause as acute myocardial infarction, but those clinical words couldn't capture the sound of my world ending. Christopher was only 36. We'd talked about growing old together, about the kids we'd have someday, about renovating the upstairs bathroom next spring. The funeral was a blur of black clothes and forced sympathy. Christopher's family showed up in force: his mother Patricia, his brother Kevin, his sister Janet, and various cousins and aunts I'd met maybe twice in our 7 years together. They sat in the front row like they owned the grief, while I stood beside his casket feeling like an intruder at my own husband's service. Patricia barely looked at me during the entire ceremony. When people offered condolences, she accepted them as if she were the widow. When the pastor spoke about Christopher's love for his family, her eyes never once drifted in my direction. The nights after the funeral were the worst. Our house felt enormous and empty, full of Christopher's things but empty of everything that mattered. His coffee mug still sat in the sink where I'd left it, unwashed. His reading glasses were still on the nightstand next to a book he'd never finish. I'd lie in our bed, listening to the house settle, and wonder how I was supposed to keep existing in a world without him. That's when they started with the phone calls. Nothing direct at first, just Patricia checking in to see how I was managing. Kevin asking if I needed help with arrangements. Janet wondering if I'd thought about what comes next. I should have seen it coming. To understand what happened next, you need to know about Christopher's family. Patricia Grant was the kind of woman who smiled with her mouth but never her eyes, especially when she looked at me. She'd raised her children to believe that family was everything, but her definition of family was narrow and conditional. Christopher was her golden boy, the successful one who'd made something of himself despite, as she often reminded me, his unfortunate choice in women. Kevin, Christopher's older brother, had inherited their father's construction business and their mother's sense of entitlement. He was the kind of man who measured success by the size of his truck and the volume of his voice. He'd never quite forgiven Christopher for going to college instead of joining the family business, and he'd certainly never forgiven me for encouraging that choice. Janet was 2 years younger than Christopher and had spent most of her adult life bouncing between failed relationships and failed business ventures. She had a talent for making poor decisions and an even greater talent for blaming those decisions on everyone but herself. In her mind, Christopher's success was family success, which meant she had a stake in everything he'd achieved. There was an old family photo in Christopher's office that told the whole story. Christopher couldn't have been more than 12, standing slightly apart from the others even then. Patricia's hand was on Kevin's shoulder, her smile bright and proud. Janet was tucked close to her mother's side, grinning at the camera. And Christopher stood there, polite but distant, like he already knew he didn't quite belong. He told me once that growing up in that house meant walking on eggshells. Patricia controlled everything: what they ate, what they wore, who they could be friends with, what activities they could join. Kevin fell in line easily, becoming the perfect replica of their father. Janet rebelled but always came crawling back when she needed money or a place to stay. Christopher learned to keep his thoughts to himself and his dreams even quieter. When Christopher went away to college, the family acted like he'd betrayed them. When he met me during his junior year and brought me home for Christmas, they treated me like I'd stolen something that belonged to them. I remember that first dinner vividly, Patricia serving me smaller portions than everyone else, Kevin making jokes about city girls who thought they were too good for small-town life, Janet asking pointed questions about my family's finances and my plans for Christopher. Christopher saw it all, but confrontation wasn't in his nature. He'd squeeze my hand under the table and change the subject, or find reasons for us to leave early. After we got married, the visits became less frequent, which only made them more hostile. They'd perfected the art of the subtle insult. Patricia would comment on how tired I looked, suggesting that maybe I wasn't taking good enough care of myself, or by extension, her son. Kevin would make jokes about how Christopher was whipped, implying that I controlled him in ways that real men wouldn't tolerate. Janet would ask about our plans for children with a tone that suggested she thought I was deliberately preventing Christopher from fulfilling his family obligations, but it was the financial comments that cut deepest. They somehow always managed to bring up money, how expensive my clothes looked, how nice our house was, how lucky I was to have married so well. The implication was always clear: I was a gold digger who'd trapped their precious Christopher. The truth was exactly the opposite. When we met, I was working 2 jobs to pay for nursing school. Christopher was the one with the trust fund, the one whose grandfather had left him enough money to buy our house outright. I brought student loans and determination to our marriage. He brought inherited wealth and a family that would never let me forget which one of us really belonged. After Christopher died, their true nature came out in small ways at first. Patricia's calls became more frequent and more pointed. She'd ask about the mortgage, about Christopher's life insurance, about whether I'd considered simplifying my living situation. Kevin started dropping by unannounced, always with some excuse about picking up something that had belonged to their father or checking on maintenance issues he claimed Christopher had mentioned. Janet was the most direct. 2 days after the funeral, she asked if I'd thought about moving somewhere smaller, somewhere more appropriate for a single woman. When I asked what she meant, she shrugged and said, "Well, it's not like you have children to think about. That big house is probably more than you can handle on your own." I should have recognized the coordinated effort, the way they were all circling like vultures waiting for the right moment to strike. But I was drowning in grief, barely managing to get through each day without completely falling apart. I thought their sudden attention was awkward sympathy, not calculated greed. I was wrong. Patricia arrived on a Wednesday morning exactly 2 weeks after Christopher's funeral. I remember the date because I'd been marking time differently since he died. Everything was either before or after, and that Wednesday marked my first full 2 weeks in the after. I was still in my pajamas, nursing my 3rd cup of coffee and staring at a pile of Christopher's clothes I couldn't bring myself to pack away. The doorbell rang, and through the peephole, I saw Patricia standing on my front porch with a manila envelope tucked under her arm and that particular smile she wore when she was about to deliver bad news while pretending it was good news. "Melody, dear," she said when I opened the door, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "I hope you don't mind me stopping by. I brought some things I thought you should see." She was dressed like she was going to a business meeting, navy blue suit, sensible heels, hair styled in her trademark perfect bob. I suddenly felt underdressed and vulnerable in my old flannel pajamas, which I'm sure was exactly how she intended me to feel. "I know this is difficult," she continued, settling herself on my living room couch like she owned it, "but we need to discuss some practical matters. Christopher wouldn't want us to avoid the hard conversations." She pulled out a handwritten note on her personal stationery, cream-colored paper with "Patricia Grant" embossed in gold letters at the top. Her handwriting was precise, each letter formed with the same careful attention she paid to everything else in her life. I wrote down some thoughts about your situation, she said, handing me the note. I wanted to make sure I covered everything. The note was written in her typical style, formal but warm on the surface, cold as ice underneath. "My dear Melody, I know these past weeks have been incredibly difficult for you. Christopher's death has been a shock to all of us, and I want you to know that the family is thinking of you during this challenging time. As we all begin to process this loss, there are some practical matters that need to be addressed. I'm sure you understand that the house holds special meaning for our family, and we believe Christopher would want it to remain within the family for future generations. We've prepared some paperwork that will help make this transition as smooth as possible for everyone involved. Please know that this comes from a place of love and concern for your well-being. With sympathy, Patricia*. I read it twice, trying to understand what she was really saying. "What kind of paperwork?" That's when she pulled out the manila envelope. "Well, that's the difficult part, dear. You see, we've been looking into the legal aspects of Christopher's estate, and there are some complications we need to resolve. She spread several official-looking documents across my coffee table with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this before. The first document that caught my eye was stamped with the county clerk's seal and had "Notice to Quit" printed in bold letters across the top. "What is this?" I asked, my coffee cup trembling in my hands. "It's an eviction notice, dear. I know it sounds harsh, but legally, that's what we have to file to begin the process of transferring the property back to the family." The words hit me like a physical blow. Eviction notice? This is my home. Christopher and I bought this house. Together. Patricia's smile never wavered. "Oh, sweetheart, I understand your confusion. But you see, Christopher inherited this house from his grandfather. It was always meant to stay in the family. Your name may have been added to some paperwork for convenience, but the intent was always clear." I stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. "That's not true. We bought this house together. We both signed the mortgage papers." "Actually," she said, pulling out another document, "if you look at the original purchase agreement, you'll see that Christopher provided the full down payment from his inheritance. The mortgage was taken out in both names, yes, but the equity has always belonged to the family." Before I could respond, I heard cars pulling into my driveway. Through the window, I saw Kevin's oversized pickup truck and Janet's sedan. They climbed out and walked toward my front door with the coordination of people who'd planned this moment carefully. "I hope you don't mind," Patricia said as the doorbell rang again. "I asked Kevin and Janet to join us. This affects the whole family, and we thought it would be better to handle everything at once." Kevin filled my doorway when I opened it, his work boots muddy and his expression grim. Janet slipped in behind him, carrying a cardboard box and wearing the same false sympathy smile as her mother. "Hey, Melody," Kevin said, his voice gentler than usual but still carrying an edge of authority. "Mom told us she was coming over to talk about the house situation. We thought you might want some support." Janet set down her box and gave me a brief, awkward hug. "We brought some of Christopher's things from Mom's house," she said. "Family photos and some of his childhood stuff. We thought you might want to keep." They arranged themselves around my living room like they were conducting a business meeting. Patricia remained on the couch, Kevin took the armchair that had been Christopher's favorite spot, and Janet perched on the edge of the ottoman. I stood in the middle of my own living room feeling like an outsider. "The thing is, Melody," Kevin began, "we've been talking as a family about what Christopher would have wanted. And we all agree that he'd want this house to stay with the Grants. It's been in our family for 3 generations. That's not how marriage works," I said, finding my voice. "When Christopher married me, I became family too." Janet laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Of course you're family, sweetie. But you're young, you'll move on. You'll probably remarry someday and have your own family. But this house, this land, it represents something bigger than just a place to live." Patricia stood up and walked over to me, placing her hands on my shoulders like she was consoling a child. "We're not trying to hurt you, dear. We're trying to help you move forward. Staying in this big house, surrounded by memories of Christopher, isn't healthy. You need a fresh start." "Where exactly do you expect me to go?" I asked. "Well," Patricia said, returning to her seat, "we've actually thought about that too. There's a lovely apartment complex about 20 minutes from here. 1-bedroom units, very affordable, perfect for a single woman starting over." Kevin leaned forward. "The thing is, Melody, we need you to sign these papers today. The legal process is complicated, and we want to make sure everything is handled properly. The longer we wait, the more expensive it gets for everyone." I looked at the documents scattered across my coffee table, the eviction notice, property transfer forms, and what looked like a quitclaim deed. "And if I don't sign?" The 3 of them exchanged glances, and Patricia's smile finally faltered. "Well, dear, then we'll have to pursue this through the courts. And that would be unfortunate for everyone involved. Legal battles are expensive and public, and I'm sure you wouldn't want Christopher's memory tainted by that kind of drama." The threat was clear, even wrapped in her polite language. "Sign the papers and leave quietly, or they'd drag me through a legal battle I couldn't afford to fight." "I need time to think about this," I said. "Of course," Patricia said, standing and gathering her papers. "But please don't take too long. We've already started the legal paperwork, and these things have timelines." They left as efficiently as they'd arrived, taking their documents but leaving behind the box of Christopher's childhood things like a consolation prize. I sat on my couch, staring at the space where they'd just been, trying to understand how quickly my world had shifted again. In the box, I found Christopher's old baseball glove, some elementary school reports cards, and a high school yearbook. At the bottom was a small notebook with his teenage handwriting scrawled across the cover, "Private, keep out." I opened it and found page after page of his thoughts about his family, his dreams of escape, and his plans for a different kind of life. On the last written page, in handwriting that was older but still recognizably his, he'd written, "The only way to protect yourself from people who think they own you is to make sure they never actually do." For the first time since Christopher died, I smiled. The phone calls started that very evening. First Patricia, then Kevin, then Janet, a coordinated campaign designed to wear down my resistance through repetition and pressure. Patricia called while I was making dinner, her voice honey-sweet but with steel underneath. "Melody, dear, I've been thinking about our conversation today. I hope you understand that we're only looking out for your best interests." "My best interests?" I stirred my soup harder than necessary. "How is kicking me out of my home in my best interests?" "Oh, sweetheart, you're not thinking clearly. Grief can cloud our judgment. That house is far too expensive for someone in your situation. Have you looked at the property taxes? The maintenance costs? Christopher handled all of that, didn't he?" She was right about one thing: Christopher had handled most of our finances. But not because I couldn't. Because he wanted to. He'd insisted on taking care of what he called the boring stuff so I could focus on my nursing career. "I can learn," I said. "Of course you can, dear. But why struggle when you don't have to?" Kevin spoke to a realtor friend of his, and she thinks the house could sell for quite a bit. "After we settle the family debts, there should be enough left over to help you get started somewhere new." "Family debts?" There was a pause, and I could practically hear Patricia recalibrating her approach. "Well, Christopher's medical bills. Of course. And there were some business investments he made with Kevin that need to be resolved. Nothing for you to worry about, but these things do need to be handled properly." An hour later, Kevin called. His approach was more direct, more intimidating. "Look, Melody, I'm going to be straight with you. That house represents everything my grandfather worked for. He built the family business from nothing, bought that land when it was just farmland, and always intended for it to stay in the family." "Christopher was family too," I said. "Christopher was family. But he's gone now. And you," he paused, and I could hear him choosing his words carefully. "You're not a Grant anymore. You're a widow. That's different." "I'm still Christopher's wife." "No, you're Christopher's widow. There's a difference. And the sooner you accept that, the easier this will be for everyone." Kevin's voice got harder. "Here's the thing you need to understand: Christopher might have put your name on some paperwork, but he never contributed a dime to that house. The down payment came from his inheritance. The monthly payments came from money his grandfather left him. Even the improvements we made over the years, that was family money. We both worked. We both contributed." Kevin laughed, but it wasn't friendly. "You contributed what, exactly? Your nursing salary? Melody, you made maybe $40,000 a year. That house cost $300,000. Christopher's trust fund payments alone were more than your entire salary. Don't pretend you were equal partners in this." The cruelty of his words took my breath away. In one conversation, he'd reduced our entire marriage to a financial transaction and found me lacking. Janet called just before bedtime, taking yet another approach, the concerned sister-in-law who just wanted what was best for everyone. "Melody, I know this is hard. I know Kevin can be blunt, and Mom can be a little controlling. But we really are trying to help you." "Help me how?" "By taking my home. By helping you face reality. Honey, you're 34 years old. You're smart, you're attractive, you have a good career. You could start over anywhere. But if you stay in that house, you'll just be living in the past." Janet's voice took on the tone of someone sharing a difficult truth. "The thing is, we all know Christopher felt guilty about the money situation. He loved you, but he knew you married him when he was poor, and then his grandfather died and suddenly he had all this money. He used to worry that you felt like you owed him something. That's not true. Isn't it? Think about it, Melody. You never really acted like an equal partner in that marriage. You let Christopher handle all the finances, all the big decisions. You were always so grateful for everything he gave you. That's not partnership, that's dependency." Her words stung because they contained just enough truth to hurt. I had let Christopher handle our finances, mostly because he'd insisted and because he was better at it. I had been grateful for the life we'd built together, because I'd grown up with so much less. "Christopher used to worry about what would happen to you if something happened to him," Janet continued. "He knew you'd try to hold on to everything out of sentimentality, even if it wasn't practical. That's why he talked to us about making sure you'd be taken care of properly." "He talked to you about me?" "Of course he did. We were his family. He loved you, but he needed people who could give him objective advice. People who weren't emotionally invested in keeping things exactly the same." I hung up on her then, but the damage was done. They'd planted seeds of doubt that would grow in the dark hours of the night. Had Christopher really talked to them about me? Had he worried that I was too dependent on him? Had our marriage been as unequal as they were suggesting? I found myself going through Christopher's medical bills, which had been arriving steadily since his death. The amounts were staggering: emergency room visits, specialist consultations, tests I didn't even understand. Our insurance had covered most of it, but even the remaining balances were more than I made in several months. Then there were the credit card statements I'd never paid attention to before. Christopher had handled all of this, but now I could see the monthly charges that had seemed normal when he was alive but looked enormous now: property taxes, homeowner's insurance, utilities for a house much larger than I needed. For the first time, real doubt crept in. Maybe they were right. Maybe I was being sentimental and impractical. Maybe I couldn't afford to keep the house on my own. Maybe I really was just a widow trying to hold on to a life that had never truly belonged to me. But then I remembered Christopher's notebook, and the entry I'd read: the only way to protect yourself from people who think they own you is to make sure they never actually do. Christopher hadn't written that about strangers. He'd written it about his family. And for some reason, that thought gave me the strength to turn off my phone and go to bed without signing their papers. Tomorrow, I decided, I would start asking my own questions about what Christopher had really wanted. And more importantly, I would start asking questions about what I wanted for my own future. The Grants had underestimated me once. I wouldn't let them do it again. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about what Janet had said, about Christopher worrying that I felt like I owed him something, about him discussing our marriage with his family like I was a problem to be solved. So I did what I always did when I needed to feel close to him. I pulled out our wedding album. We met 7 years ago at the most unlikely place, a laundromat near the university. I was in my final year of nursing school, working 2 part-time jobs and living in a studio apartment that didn't have its own washer and dryer. Christopher was in graduate school for business, but unlike most of the trust fund kids in his program, he was doing his own laundry at midnight because that's when the machines were cheapest. I remember him struggling with the industrial washing machine, cursing softly as quarters scattered across the floor. He looked nothing like the polished businessman he would become, just a tired graduate student in wrinkled khakis and a faded t-shirt, trying to figure out why his clothes came out soapy every week. "You're using too much detergent," I told him. "And the wrong water temperature for those colors." He looked up at me with the most grateful expression I'd ever seen. "I've been ruining my clothes for months. My mother always did my laundry, and then I lived in dorms with cleaning services. I'm completely helpless." That's how we started, me teaching him how to separate lights and darks, him buying me coffee from the vending machine while we waited for our cycles to finish. We talked about everything during those late-night laundromat sessions. He told me about the pressure of living up to his family's expectations, about feeling trapped by money he'd never asked for. I told him about growing up in foster care, about working my way through school, about my dream of becoming a nurse practitioner. Christopher was different from anyone I'd ever dated. He was kind without trying to impress anyone, smart without being condescending, and generous in ways that had nothing to do with money. When I got the flu during finals week, he brought me soup and helped me study. When my car broke down, he didn't offer to buy me a new one. He spent his Saturday learning how to change my brake pads from YouTube videos. The first time he brought me home to meet his family was Christmas of our second year together. I was nervous, obviously. Christopher came from money, and I came from nothing. But I thought love would be enough to bridge that gap. I was wrong. Patricia answered the door wearing a dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent, looking me up and down like she was appraising livestock. "So you're the nursing student Christopher's been telling us about." The way she said, nursing student, made it sound like a communicable disease. Dinner was an interrogation disguised as polite conversation. What did my parents do for work? Where did I grow up? What were my long-term goals? When I mentioned that I'd aged out of foster care at 18, the table went quiet. Not sympathetic quiet, uncomfortable quiet, like I'd admitted to something shameful. Kevin dominated the conversation with stories about the family construction business, making sure I understood how successful they were, how many properties they owned, how much money they'd made. Janet talked about her latest business venture, some kind of boutique that was going to make her rich, while Patricia made subtle comments about girls who thought they could marry their way out of poverty. Christopher tried to deflect, changing the subject whenever his family got too pointed, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. This was the family dynamic he'd grown up with: constant judgment, constant pressure to prove your worth through achievement and accumulation. After dinner, while the others watched football, Christopher walked me around the family property. It was beautiful, 15 acres of rolling hills, with the old farmhouse his grandfather had built and the newer house where Patricia lived. Christopher showed me the creek where he'd played as a child, the barn where he'd hidden when he needed to escape family gatherings. "They'll warm up to you," he said, but he didn't sound convinced. "Will they?" I asked. Christopher stopped walking and took my hands. It doesn't matter if they do. I love you. That's what matters. But it did matter, and we both knew it. For the next 5 years, every family gathering was a subtle battle. Patricia would comment on my clothes, my hair, my career choices. Kevin would make jokes about Christopher being whipped whenever he chose my preferences over family traditions. Janet would ask pointed questions about our timeline for marriage and children, implying that I was holding Christopher back from his destiny. The worst part was watching Christopher try to navigate between his family's expectations and his love for me. He'd defend me when they went too far, but he'd also try to smooth things over, to find compromises that usually meant I was the one who had to bend. When we finally got engaged, Patricia's response was telling. Well, I suppose if Christopher's made up his mind. Not congratulations, not welcome to the family, just resigned acceptance that her son was making a mistake she'd have to live with. Our wedding was beautiful despite his family's lack of enthusiasm. Christopher insisted on paying for everything himself, using money from his trust fund rather than letting his family contribute and have opinions about every detail. We kept it small and simple, just close friends and immediate family at a little chapel near the university where we'd met. In our wedding photos, you can see the divide clearly. My friends, a mix of fellow nursing students, co-workers, and the chosen family I'd built over the years, are laughing and celebrating. Christopher's family is there, dressed appropriately and smiling for the camera, but there's a distance in their eyes, like they're attending an obligation rather than a celebration. The best photo from that day isn't in the formal album. It's a candid shot someone took of Christopher and me during our first dance. We're looking at each other like we're the only two people in the world, completely oblivious to everything else. That's how our marriage felt for most of 7 years, like we'd created our own little world where love mattered more than money or family approval. Christopher was patient with his family's coldness toward me, but he wasn't blind to it. As the years went on, he started setting boundaries. We'd visit for major holidays but leave early. He'd take their calls but wouldn't discuss our private business. When they made comments about my background or our choices, he'd shut them down more firmly. They're stuck in the past, he told me once after a particularly difficult family dinner. They think happiness comes from having the right job, the right house, the right connections. They don't understand that I'm already happier than I've ever been. That's when he started talking about protecting what we'd built together. My family sees everything as a business transaction, he said. Even relationships. I never want you to feel like you owe anyone anything, especially them. I didn't fully understand what he meant then. I thought he was just talking about maintaining our independence, about not letting his family's money create obligations or expectations. I didn't realize he was already thinking about concrete steps to protect me from exactly what was happening now. Looking through our wedding album that night, I found a handwritten note Christopher had slipped into the back cover, something he must have put there years ago but never mentioned. For Melody, in case I ever forget to tell you, you are my choice, my partner, my equal in everything that matters. No one else gets to decide what our life looks like or what our love is worth. You are enough, exactly as you are. See, I cried, reading those words, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of determination. Christopher had seen this coming. He'd known his family would try to diminish me, to make me feel like I didn't deserve the life we'd built together, but he'd also prepared for it. And tomorrow, I was going to find out exactly how. The memory came back to me as I sat in Christopher's office, surrounded by his books and papers, trying to piece together what he'd meant about protecting ourselves. It was a conversation from 5 years ago that I'd almost forgotten, one of those late-night talks that happen when you can't sleep and find yourself sharing thoughts you've never spoken aloud. We'd been married for 2 years then, and the novelty of living in our beautiful house had settled into comfortable routine. But that particular night, Christopher was restless. I found him at 2 a.m. sitting in the kitchen, staring out the window at the backyard he'd been planning to landscape. Can't sleep? I asked, settling into the chair beside him. Just thinking, he said, but there was something heavy in his voice that made me pay attention. About what? Christopher was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his words came slowly, like he was working out a problem in real time. Melody, what do you know about my grandfather? I knew the basics. Thomas Grant had started with nothing, built a successful construction business, bought land when it was cheap, left his grandchildren substantial inheritances. Not much beyond what you've told me. Why? He kept journals. Detailed records of everything, business decisions, family dynamics, money. I found them in the attic last weekend when I was looking for Christmas decorations. Christopher got up and retrieved a leather-bound notebook from the kitchen counter. Listen to this entry from 1987. Kevin's wedding was beautiful, but I fear Patricia has chosen his bride for him. The girl seems nice enough, but she lacks the spine to stand up to Patricia when it matters. I predict she'll be absorbed into the family completely within 5 years, her own identity dissolved into whatever Patricia needs her to be. He flipped pages. And this one from 1992, Kevin's wife came to me today asking for advice about Patricia's interference with their children. I told her what I told Kevin years ago, that the only way to deal with Patricia is to set firm boundaries and enforce them consistently. But I can see in her eyes that she won't do it. She's too afraid of conflict, too dependent on family approval. The children will suffer for it. I listened as Christopher read entry after entry about family dynamics I was only beginning to understand. His grandfather had seen everything: Patricia's controlling nature, Kevin's willingness to be controlled, Janet's instability, and most importantly, the way the family treated outsiders. "Here's one about you," Christopher said, his voice softer. "From last Christmas, Christopher brought his young lady again. She's different from the others, not trying to impress, not intimidated by Patricia's games. She holds her own quietly but firmly. Most importantly, I can see that Christopher is genuinely happy for the first time in years. But I worry about what will happen to her when I'm gone. Patricia sees her as a threat to family control, and she's right to worry. This girl might actually save my grandson from becoming another Kevin." Christopher closed the journal and looked at me directly. "Melody, my grandfather died 3 months after he wrote that. But before he died, he pulled me aside and told me something I need to share with you." He reached across the table and took my hands. He said, "Christopher, you're going to inherit more money than you know what to do with. Your mother and siblings are going to see that money is family money, not yours. They're going to expect to have a say in how you spend it, who you marry, how you live your life. And if something happens to you, they're going to try to take it all back from whoever you leave behind." The kitchen felt very quiet suddenly. "What did he tell you to do?" "He said the only way to protect the people you love from people who think they own you is to make sure they never actually do." Christopher squeezed my hands. "Melody, I need to ask you something, and I need you to trust me even if it sounds crazy." "Okay. I want to put everything in your name. The house, the investment accounts, everything. I want to make you the sole owner of all of it." I stared at him. "Christopher, that's insane. This is your inheritance. I can't take that from you." "You're not taking it from me. I'm giving it to you. There's a difference." He stood up and started pacing, the way he did when he was working through a complex problem. "Think about it, Melody. If everything is in both our names, then legally, my family could contest things if something happened to me. They could claim you were manipulating me, or that you don't deserve half of what my grandfather left me. But if everything is in your name alone, then they have no legal claim at all," I finished. "Exactly. And here's the thing, I trust you. Completely. I know you'd never do anything to hurt me or cut me out of my own life. But my family doesn't know that, and their not knowing is what protects us." I was quiet for a long time, trying to understand what he was proposing. "But Christopher, what if something happens to me? What if we get divorced? What if, then I guess I'll be poor," he said with a smile. "But Melody, I'd rather be poor and know that I protected the person I love than rich and watch my family destroy her after I'm gone." We talked until sunrise about the practicalities, the legal implications, the risks. Christopher had clearly been thinking about this for months. He'd already consulted with a lawyer who specialized in estate planning, someone outside the family's usual circle of advisors. The lawyer had assured him that what he wanted to do was completely legal, if unconventional. "The key," Christopher explained, "is that it has to be a gift, not a transfer for consideration. I'm giving you everything because I want to, not because you're giving me something in return. And it has to be documented properly, with witnesses, so no one can claim later that you forced me or tricked me." "What will you tell your family?" "Nothing. That's the whole point. As far as they know, everything is still the way it's always been. We'll keep living our lives exactly the same way, making decisions together, sharing everything. The only difference is that legally, you'll be protected if anything happens to me." I thought about Patricia's cold stares, Kevin's dismissive comments, Janet's pointed questions about my intentions. I thought about Christopher's grandfather's journal entries and his warnings about what would happen when he was gone. "When would we do this?" "Tomorrow, if you're willing. I've already scheduled the appointment." The next day, we spent 3 hours in a lawyer's office signing papers that transferred Christopher's entire inheritance to me. The house, the investment accounts, the trust fund proceeds, all of it went from Christopher Grant to Melody Grant. With the stroke of a pen, walking out of that office, I felt strange. Not powerful, exactly, but protected in a way I'd never been before. Christopher seemed lighter, like he'd solved a problem that had been weighing on him for months. "Any regrets?" I asked as we drove home. "Only one," he said. "I should have done this sooner." That night, Christopher made me promise 3 things. First, that I would never tell his family what we'd done unless it became absolutely necessary. Second, that I would never let anyone, including him, make me feel guilty about protecting myself. And third, that if something ever happened to him, I would remember that everything he'd given me was given freely, out of love, and that I deserved to keep it all. Promise me, Melody. Promise me you'll fight for yourself if you have to. I promised. Not knowing that 5 years later, I'd need to remember every word of that conversation, sitting in his office now. I pulled out the file folder he'd labeled Important Papers and found copies of all the transfer documents, along with a letter in his handwriting. If you're reading this, something has happened to me, and my family is probably making you feel like you don't deserve the life we built together. Don't listen to them. Every penny, every asset, every piece of property was transferred to you legally and willingly because I loved you and wanted to protect you. You owe them nothing. You owe me nothing. This is yours now. Use it wisely, and don't let anyone tell you that love isn't worth fighting for. Christopher, I folded the letter carefully and put it back in the file. Tomorrow, I would call the lawyer Christopher had used for the transfers. It was time to find out exactly what weapons I had in this fight his family had started. They thought they could intimidate me into giving up everything Christopher and I had built together. They were about to learn how wrong they were. The next morning, I called the law office of Harrison and Associates, the firm Christopher had used for our estate planning. The receptionist told me that Mr. Harrison was in court, but his associate, Ms. Chen, could see me that afternoon if it was urgent. It's urgent, I said. Ms. Chen turned out to be a sharp woman in her 40s who listened to my story without interruption, taking notes on a legal pad while I explained about Christopher's death, his family's eviction notice, and their claims about the house belonging to them. Do you have the documents your husband mentioned? She asked when I finished. I pulled out Christopher's file folder and spread the papers across her desk. Ms. Chen examined each document carefully, occasionally making small sounds of approval. These are very thorough, she said finally. Your husband worked with Mr. Harrison to create what we call an irrevocable gift structure. Everything was transferred to you as sole owner 5 years ago, properly witnessed and notarized. But his family says the house was always meant to stay with them. They're claiming I never really contributed to it. Ms. Chen smiled. Mrs. Grant, it doesn't matter what they claim. Legal ownership isn't determined by who paid for what or what anyone's intentions were beyond what's documented. According to these papers, you have been the sole legal owner of all these assets for 5 years. She pulled out a thick book and flipped to a marked section. Under state property law, when someone makes a completed gift of real estate, the original owner loses all legal claim to that property. Your husband gave up his ownership rights voluntarily and permanently when he executed these transfers. So the eviction notice is completely invalid. They have no legal standing to evict you from property they don't own. Ms. Chen leaned back in her chair. Mrs. Grant, I'm going to be very direct with you. Your in-laws are either poorly informed about property law, or they're deliberately trying to intimidate you into giving up assets they have no right to claim. I felt a wave of relief so strong it made me dizzy. What should I do? First, we're going to send them a cease and desist letter making it clear that their eviction notice is invalid and that any further attempts to claim ownership of your property will be considered harassment. She pulled out a fresh legal pad. Second, we're going to file a quiet title action to officially confirm your ownership in court, which will create a public record that settles this matter permanently. Ms. Chen explained the process while I took notes. A quiet title action would require the family to prove their ownership claim in court, something they couldn't do because they had no legal basis for their claim. The filing would also trigger a title search that would reveal the complete ownership history of the property. How long does this take? I asked. The initial filing creates immediate legal protection for you. The complete process takes about 90 days, but once we file, anyone trying to claim ownership of your property will have to prove their case in court rather than just making threats. I thought about Patricia's manila envelope and Kevin's intimidating presence in my living room. What if they escalate things? What if they try to force their way into the house or change the locks? That would be criminal trespassing and breaking and entering. We'll include language in our cease and desist letter making it clear that they have no right of entry to the property. Ms. Chen made another note. Mrs. Grant, I want you to understand something important. Your husband was very careful about how he structured these transfers. He clearly anticipated that his family might challenge your ownership, and he made sure you'd be protected. She showed me a section of the transfer documents I hadn't noticed before, a detailed affidavit Christopher had signed stating that the transfers were made freely, without coercion, and with full understanding of their legal implications. He also included a clause here that makes his family liable for your legal fees if they file frivolous claims against your ownership. That's very unusual, and it tells me he was specifically worried about this exact scenario. I felt a mixture of grief and gratitude. Even after death, Christopher was still protecting me. There's one more thing, Ms. Chen said, pulling out a final document from Christopher's file. Your husband also executed what's called a recorded affidavit of gift. This document was filed with the county recorder's office 5 years ago, creating a permanent public record of the transfer. She handed me a copy of the recorded document, stamped with the county seal and dated exactly 5 years ago. Mrs. Grant, this means that anyone who wanted to challenge your ownership would have had to do so within the statute of limitations, which in this state is 3 years for gift transfers. They're 2 years too late to contest the validity of your ownership even if they had grounds to do so, which they don't. I stared at the document, understanding for the first time how comprehensively Christopher had anticipated and prepared for this situation. He really thought of everything, didn't he? Your husband was very thorough. He clearly loved you very much and wanted to make sure you'd be protected no matter what happened. Ms. Chen outlined the immediate next steps. She would draft and send the cease and desist letter that day, file the quiet title action by the end of the week, and prepare a comprehensive legal brief documenting my ownership that I could use if the family continued their harassment. I also recommend that you change the locks on your house immediately and install a security system if you don't already have one. Legally, they have no right to enter your property, but it's better to be safe. Walking out of the law office, I felt more confident than I had since Christopher's death. I wasn't just a grieving widow trying to hold on to memories, I was a property owner defending my legal rights against people who had no claim to what they were demanding. I drove straight to the county courthouse to see the recorded documents for myself. The clerk in the recorder's office was helpful, pulling up the property records on her computer and printing copies for me. Here's the original deed from when the property was purchased, she said, handing me a document showing Christopher as the sole owner. And here's the gift transfer recorded 5 years later, showing the property transferred to you with no liens or encumbrances. I studied the documents, seeing the clear paper trail that proved my ownership. But more than that, I could see Christopher's careful planning in every detail, the timing of the transfers, the specific legal language used, the comprehensive documentation that would make any challenge nearly impossible. The property tax records told an even more interesting story. For the past 5 years, all tax bills had been sent to me as the sole owner, and I had paid them from our joint checking account. There was no ambiguity, no shared ownership, no family claims, just clear, documented proof that I owned everything free and clear. That evening, I called Ms. Chen with one final question. What happens if they ignore the cease and desist letter and keep trying to force me out? Then we escalate to harassment charges and restraining orders. Mrs. Grant, you have all the legal protections you need. The question now is whether you're ready to use them. I thought about Christopher's letter, about his grandfather's warnings, about the promise I'd made 5 years ago to fight for myself if I had to. I'm ready, I said. That night, I decided to read more of Christopher's grandfather's journals. If I was going to fight his family, I needed to understand exactly who I was dealing with. Christopher had left the journals in a box in our bedroom closet, along with other family documents he'd inherited. The journals painted a picture of Thomas Grant as a man who'd built something from nothing but lived to regret how his success had changed his children. Entry after entry detailed his growing disappointment with Patricia's manipulation and control, Kevin's weakness, and Janet's instability, but it was an entry from 1995 that made me understand the real scope of what I was facing. Patricia came to me today demanding that I change my will. She wants me to leave everything to the family trust she's proposed, with her as the primary trustee. She claims this would be better for tax purposes, but I can see what she really wants: control over every penny even after I'm dead. She's convinced Kevin that this is the right approach, and even Janet agrees, probably because she thinks Patricia will be more generous with distributions than I would be. But I've been watching Patricia for 30 years now. I've seen how she treats people who depend on her, how she uses money to control behavior, how she punishes anyone who doesn't fall in line with her plans. I would rather burn every dollar I've earned than let her use my money to control my grandchildren the way she's controlled my sons. I've decided to leave everything directly to the grandchildren in individual trusts, with very specific instructions. That Patricia is never to serve as trustee or have any control over the distributions. If she wants to influence how the money is spent, she'll have to persuade each grandchild individually rather than controlling them through a single mechanism. The next entry, dated a week later, was even more revealing. Patricia's reaction to my decision was exactly what I expected: rage disguised as concern for the family's legacy. She spent 2 hours explaining why my approach was wrong, why the family needed unified financial management, why individual trusts would lead to chaos and conflict. What she really meant was that individual trusts would prevent her from controlling how the money is used. Christopher could use his inheritance to move away from the family business. He could marry someone she disapproves of without worrying about financial consequences. He could make choices based on what makes him happy rather than what makes her happy. That's exactly why I'm structuring things this way. I've watched Patricia destroy Kevin's spine and Janet's confidence. I won't let her do the same to Christopher. I found the original will Thomas Grant had executed, filed away in the same box. Sure enough, Christopher's inheritance had come to him directly, with no family trust, no shared control, and no strings attached. His grandfather had given him the freedom to make his own choices, including the choice to protect me, but there was more. Buried in the family financial records, I found evidence of something that explained a lot about the family's current desperation. Kevin's construction business was failing. The financial statements from the past 3 years showed declining revenues, mounting debts, and a company on the edge of bankruptcy. Several major projects had gone over budget, and the company was facing multiple lawsuits from clients claiming defective work. Even worse, Patricia had been using her own inheritance to prop up Kevin's business, making loans that were never repaid and investments that would never show returns. Her financial statements showed that most of her money was tied up in Kevin's company, making her almost as financially vulnerable as he was. Janet's situation was equally dire. Her boutique business had failed 2 years ago, leaving her with significant debt and no reliable income. She'd moved back in with Patricia 6 months ago, officially to help with family business, but clearly because she had nowhere else to go. The more I read, the clearer it became. The Grant family was broke. Christopher's inheritance was the only substantial money left, and they desperately needed it to save themselves from financial ruin. Thomas Grant's final journal entry, dated just weeks before his death, seemed prophetic. I'm dying, and I know it. The doctors say I have maybe 6 months, but I can feel my body failing. I'm not afraid of death, but I am afraid of what will happen to my family after I'm gone. Patricia will try to take control of everything, including money that isn't rightfully hers. She'll claim it's for the good of the family, but it will really be to save her from the consequences of her own poor decisions and Kevin's failures. She'll use guilt, manipulation, and intimidation to get what she wants, just like she always has. Christopher is my last hope for this family. He's the only one who inherited my work ethic without inheriting Patricia's need to control everything around him. If he can stay strong, if he can resist their pressure and make his own choices, maybe something good can come from everything I've built. But if Patricia gets her claws into his inheritance, she'll use it to enable Kevin's continued failures and Janet's irresponsibility, and within 5 years, it will all be gone. 3 generations of work, destroyed by 1 generation's greed and incompetence. I pray Christopher is strong enough to protect what I'm leaving him. More than that, I pray he's smart enough to protect it from his own family. I closed the journal and sat in the quiet darkness of our bedroom, understanding finally why Patricia had seemed so confident about her eviction notice, why Kevin had been so aggressive about their timeline, why Janet had been so insistent that I didn't belong in this house. They weren't just being cruel. They were being desperate. Christopher's inheritance represented their last chance to avoid financial ruin. Without it, Kevin's business would collapse completely, taking Patricia's remaining money with it. Janet would have to declare bankruptcy and find actual employment for the first time in years. The Grant family's comfortable lifestyle, their social standing, their entire identity built around wealth and success, all of it would disappear. But here's what they hadn't counted on. Christopher had seen this coming. He'd read the same journals, seen the same financial records, understood the same family dynamics. That's why he'd been so determined to protect his inheritance from them. Not because he was selfish, but because he knew they would destroy it. Just like they'd destroyed everything else they'd touched. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through the missed calls from the past few days. 12 calls from Patricia, 8 from Kevin, 6 from Janet. The frequency was increasing, the desperation growing. They needed my house, my money, my inheritance more than I'd realized. Which meant they were far more dangerous than I'd thought. But also far more vulnerable. Tomorrow, I would start learning everything I could about their financial situation. If this was going to be a war, I needed to understand the battlefield completely, and I needed to understand that in this war, I held all the weapons. The escalation began the next morning with a certified letter delivered at 7 a.m. The postal worker had to wake me up to sign for it, apologizing for the early hour but explaining that someone had paid extra for immediate delivery. The letter was from Grant Family Legal Services, which I quickly realized was just a fancy letterhead Kevin had created to make his demands sound official. The language was aggressive and intimidating, full of legal-sounding phrases that meant nothing. Mrs. Grant, you are hereby notified that your continued occupation of the property located at 1247 Maple Ridge Road constitutes unlawful possession of family assets. You have 72 hours to vacate the premises and surrender all keys, security codes, and property access devices to the undersigned. Failure to comply will result in immediate legal action and enforcement procedures. It was signed by Kevin with some made-up title like Family Estate Administrator. At the bottom, in smaller print, was a threat that made my blood boil. Be advised that continued resistance to lawful family claims may result in criminal charges for theft and fraud. An hour later, my phone started ringing. Patricia first, her voice strained with fake concern. Melody, darling, I hope you received Kevin's letter. I know it sounds harsh, but we really are trying to resolve this situation amicably. Your son threatened me with criminal charges, Patricia. That's not amicable. Oh, sweetheart, Kevin's just trying to be thorough. You know how men are, they think everything has to be done with official paperwork and legal language. But the substance is still the same. We're offering to help you transition to a more manageable living situation. By threatening to have me arrested? Patricia's voice hardened slightly. Well, dear, if you insist on being difficult, Kevin felt we needed to be clear about the potential consequences. No one wants this to become unpleasant, but we do need you to be reasonable. I hung up on her. Kevin called 30 minutes later, his approach more direct. Melody, I don't know what kind of legal advice you've been getting, but you need to understand something. This family has resources you don't have. We can drag this through the courts for years, cost you more money than you've ever seen, and, in the end, we'll still get what belongs to us. Nothing belongs to you, Kevin. Everything in that house belongs to us. Christopher never owned it free and clear, it was always family property that he was managing for the next generation. Just because some paperwork has your name on it doesn't change the fundamental reality. I could hear him getting angrier as he talked. You want to fight us? Fine. But understand what you're fighting for. You're fighting to keep a house you can't afford, filled with memories of a man who's dead, while his real family suffers because of your selfishness. His real family? His blood family. The people who knew him before you existed and who will remember him long after you've moved on to your next husband. I hung up on him too, but they weren't done. Throughout the day, I received calls from numbers I didn't recognize. When I answered, various people claiming to be family friends or business associates would tell me they'd heard about my situation and wanted to offer advice about doing the right thing. One caller claimed to be a social worker concerned about my mental health during my grief. Another said he was a financial advisor warning me about the tax implications of holding on to assets I couldn't properly manage. A third claimed to be from the county assessor's office with questions about property tax payments. I realized they were trying to gather information while simultaneously wearing down my resistance through constant harassment. Every call was designed to make me feel isolated, overwhelmed, and uncertain about my legal position. The afternoon brought a new tactic. I heard a car in my driveway and looked out to see Janet walking toward my front door carrying a casserole dish and wearing her most sympathetic expression. I brought you dinner, she said when I opened the door. I know this whole situation has been stressful, and I thought you could use some comfort food. She pushed past me into the kitchen and started bustling around like she belonged there, pulling out plates and serving spoons, chattering about the recipe and how much Christopher had always loved her tuna casserole. Janet, what are you really doing here? She stopped pretending to be domestic and looked at me with what I supposed was meant to be sisterly concern. Melody, I'm worried about you. This isn't like you, all this legal fighting and refusing to talk to family. Christopher wouldn't want us to be at war with each other. Christopher wouldn't want his family trying to steal my house. Steal? Janet laughed, but it sounded forced. Honey, nobody's stealing anything. We're trying to help you see reality. You're a single woman now. You don't need this big house with all its expenses and maintenance requirements. You could get a cute little apartment, maybe go back to school, start fresh somewhere new. She moved closer, her voice becoming more intimate. Between you and me, Mom and Kevin are being way too aggressive about this. But they're scared, Melody. Kevin's business is struggling, and Mom's getting older. They see Christopher's inheritance as the family's safety net. It's not Christopher's inheritance anymore. It's mine. Legally, maybe. But morally? Melody, you were married to Christopher. For 7 years. That's nothing compared to the 36 years he was part of this family. Do you really think it's right to keep everything while his mother and brother face financial hardship? I stared at her, amazed by the audacity. Are you seriously asking me to give up my home to bail out Kevin's failed business? Janet's mask slipped entirely. Kevin's business supports half the families in this town. If it fails, a lot of good people will lose their jobs. But sure, keep your big house. I'm sure Christopher would be proud to know his legacy is unemployment and poverty for the people his family has supported for generations. Get out of my house, Janet. Fine. But Melody, you should know, this isn't going away. The family won't give up, and honestly, neither should you. Because if you keep fighting us, people are going to start asking questions about how exactly you convinced Christopher to put everything in your name. They're going to wonder what kind of person isolates their spouse from their family and manipulates them into signing over their inheritance. The threat was clear. If I didn't surrender voluntarily, they would destroy my reputation and paint me as a manipulative gold digger who'd taken advantage of Christopher's love. After Janet left, I found myself pacing through the house, anger and fear warring in my chest. They were trying to break me down systematically: legal threats, financial pressure, social isolation, and character assassination. It was a coordinated campaign designed to make resistance seem futile, but as I walked through the rooms Christopher and I had shared, touching the furniture we'd chosen together, looking at the photographs of our life together, I felt my resolve strengthening rather than weakening. They could threaten me, harass me, and try to destroy my reputation. But they couldn't change the fundamental truth: Christopher had chosen me. He'd chosen to protect me. And he'd given me the weapons I needed to fight back. It was time to stop playing defense and start playing offense. That evening, I called Ms. Chen and told her about the escalating harassment. She listened grimly and made notes about each incident. Mrs. Grant, this has moved beyond a simple property dispute. They're engaging in a pattern of harassment and intimidation that could constitute criminal behavior. I think it's time we escalated our response. What do you recommend? Tomorrow, we file for a restraining order against all three of them. We also send a formal notice to their attorney, if they actually have one, that any further harassment will result in criminal charges. And then we go on the offensive. Offensive how? We investigate their financial situation thoroughly and determine whether they've committed any legal violations in their attempts to claim your property. If they want to fight dirty, Mrs. Grant, we'll show them what dirty really looks like. I smiled for the first time in days. Let's do it. Ms. Chen had recommended a private investigator named Marcus Webb, a former police detective who specialized in financial investigations. I met him at his office the next morning, a small space above a coffee shop that looked nothing like the glamorous detective agencies you see in movies. Mrs. Grant, he said, settling behind a desk covered with file folders, Ms. Chen filled me in on your situation. Before we start spending your money, I want to be clear about what we can and can't accomplish. Marcus was a lean man in his 50s. With graying hair and the kind of direct manner that suggested he'd dealt with plenty of family disputes gone wrong. A financial investigation can tell us about their assets, debts, income sources, and spending patterns. It can also reveal any legal problems they might be facing: lawsuits, tax liens, regulatory violations, that sort of thing. What can't it tell us? It can't prove their motives, and it can't change the fundamental legal facts of your case. You already own your property free and clear. What an investigation can do is give us leverage and help us understand how desperate they really are. I hired him on the spot. 3 days later, Marcus called with his preliminary findings. Mrs. Grant, you need to see this report in person. Can you come in this afternoon? His office felt different when I returned, more serious, with documents spread across every available surface. Marcus gestured for me to sit down and handed me a thick folder marked Grant Family Financial Analysis. Let's start with Kevin, he said, opening to a section marked with red tabs. Grant Construction is in serious trouble. They owe approximately $340,000 to various creditors, including $85,000 in unpaid payroll taxes to the IRS. He showed me copies of court documents. They're facing 3 separate lawsuits from clients claiming defective work, with damages sought totaling nearly $200,000. The business has been operating at a loss for 18 months, and Kevin has been using personal credit cards to cover basic expenses. How did you get all this information? Public records, mostly. Lawsuits are filed in public court systems. Tax liens are recorded with the county. Business licenses and regulatory filings are available through state databases. Marcus flipped to another section. The interesting part is how he's been trying to hide the extent of the problems. He showed me a series of documents revealing that Kevin had transferred several business assets to Patricia's name over the past year: trucks, equipment, even the business bank account. This looks like an attempt to shield assets from creditors, which could constitute fraudulent transfer if the timing is right. What about Patricia? Marcus's expression grew grimmer. Patricia's situation is almost worse because she should have known better. She's been using her personal inheritance to prop up Kevin's business, making what she calls family investments that are really just gifts to cover his losses. The documents showed a pattern of financial irresponsibility that was staggering. Patricia had loaned Kevin over $150,000 in the past 2 years, none of which had been repaid. She'd also co-signed several business loans that Kevin was now defaulting on, making her personally liable for the debts. She's essentially broke, Marcus explained. Her house is mortgaged to cover Kevin's business loans, her personal savings are gone, and she's facing the possibility of bankruptcy if Kevin's business fails completely. And Janet? Janet is the wild card. Marcus pulled out a thinner file. She filed for personal bankruptcy 8 months ago, claiming debts of nearly $75,000 from her failed business ventures. But here's what's interesting, she's been living with Patricia and working for Kevin's business without reporting any income to the bankruptcy court. He handed me a surveillance photo showing Janet at what appeared to be a construction site, wearing a hard hat and carrying paperwork. She's been managing Kevin's office and handling client communications, but according to her bankruptcy filings, she's unemployed with no income. That's bankruptcy fraud if we can prove she's been receiving unreported compensation. Marcus leaned back in his chair. Mrs. Grant, this family is facing complete financial collapse. Between Kevin's business debts, Patricia's personal guarantees, and Janet's bankruptcy violations, they're looking at potential criminal charges as well as civil liability. How much money would they need to solve their problems? Marcus did some quick calculations. Kevin would need about $500,000 to pay off his debts and keep the business running. Patricia would need another $200,000 to clear her personal obligations. Janet would need maybe $50,000 to settle her bankruptcy and start over legitimately. I felt a chill as I realized the scope of their desperation. Christopher's inheritance would cover all of that. Exactly. Your house alone is probably worth $400,000, and based on the financial records Ms. Chen shared with me, there are substantial investment accounts as well. From their perspective, you're sitting on the solution to all their problems. Marcus handed me one final document, a report from a forensic accountant he'd consulted. This is the most damaging finding. It appears that Kevin has been using business funds for personal expenses, paying Patricia's mortgage, covering Janet's living expenses, even funding family vacations. That's embezzlement if the business has any other investors or if he's been claiming business tax deductions for personal expenses. I studied the forensic report, seeing a pattern of financial manipulation that went back years. The Grant family hadn't just mismanaged their money, they'd been actively stealing from their own business to maintain their lifestyle. What does this mean for my situation? It means they're not just desperate, they're potentially facing criminal prosecution if anyone decides to investigate their financial dealings closely. Marcus gathered the documents into neat piles. Mrs. Grant, these people are drowning financially. They've burned through millions of dollars through poor decisions and questionable practices. Your inheritance represents their only chance to avoid complete ruin. So what do I do with this information? Marcus smiled for the first time since I'd met him. You use it as leverage. They're threatening you with legal action? You threaten them with criminal prosecution. They're questioning your right to own your property? You question their right to avoid prison for financial fraud. He handed me a summary report with the key findings highlighted. But Mrs. Grant, be very careful how you use this information. Desperate people do desperate things, and this family has already shown they're willing to harass and intimidate you. If they realize you know about their criminal exposure, they might escalate to more dangerous tactics. I left Marcus's office with a complete picture of my enemies and a powerful weapon to use against them. But I also left with a new understanding of just how dangerous this situation had become. The Grants weren't just greedy relatives trying to steal my inheritance. They were criminals facing the collapse of everything they'd built through fraud and embezzlement. They needed my money not just to maintain their lifestyle, but to stay out of prison. That made them infinitely more dangerous than I'd realized. But it also made them infinitely more vulnerable. It was time to decide whether I wanted to destroy them completely or simply force them to leave me alone. Either way, I now had the ammunition to win this war. Armed with Marcus's investigation, I realized I needed to build my own support network. The Grants had been isolating me, making me feel like I was fighting alone against an entire family. But Christopher had friends, real friends who'd known him long before he met me and who understood what kind of person he really was. I started with Tom Bradley, Christopher's best friend since college. Tom was a software engineer who lived about an hour away, and we'd always gotten along well. I called him that evening, explaining briefly what had been happening with Christopher's family. Jesus, Melody, Tom said when I finished. I can't say I'm surprised, but I'm definitely pissed off. Can I come over this weekend? There are some things you need to know about Christopher's relationship with his family. Tom arrived Saturday morning carrying a thick manila envelope and wearing the Grim expression of someone who'd been dreading this conversation. We sat in the kitchen where Christopher and I had shared so many conversations, and Tom opened his envelope. Melody, Christopher talked to me about his family situation a lot over the years. Especially after he met you and realized what a healthy relationship actually looked like. Tom pulled out several handwritten notes. He was worried about what would happen if something happened to him, so he asked me to keep records of some of our conversations. The first document was a signed and dated statement Tom had written after a conversation with Christopher 3 years ago. Chris called me tonight very upset about a family dinner where his mother and brother had made several comments about Melody being a gold digger and suggestions that he should protect his assets before their marriage became too permanent. Chris was clear that these comments were unfair and hurtful, and that he trusted Melody completely with financial decisions. He said he was considering transferring more assets to Melody's name specifically to protect her from his family's interference if anything happened to him. Tom had similar documented conversations going back 5 years, each one showing Christopher's growing concern about his family's attitudes toward me and his determination to protect our marriage from their interference. Tom, why did you write all this down? Because Christopher asked me to. He said his family had a history of rewriting the truth to suit their needs, and he wanted there to be an objective record of his real feelings and intentions. Tom handed me another document. This one is from last year, about 6 months before he died. The final statement was the most damning. Chris told me today that his mother had approached him about restructuring his finances to provide more support for Kevin's struggling business. When Chris refused and explained that he'd already transferred most assets to Melody, Patricia became angry and accused him of being controlled by that woman. Chris was very clear that the transfers were his idea, made freely, and that he would never allow his family to pressure him into changing his financial arrangements. He said, "If something happens to me, I need you to make sure everyone knows that Melody deserves everything I've given her, and my family has no right to any of it." I felt tears building as I read Christopher's words through Tom's careful documentation. He really knew this would happen. He absolutely knew. And he prepared for it. Tom reached into his envelope again. There's more. Christopher wasn't the only one who was concerned about his family's behavior. He handed me a letter from Dr. Sarah Martinez, Christopher's physician, addressed to Tom but marked, to be opened only in the event of Christopher Grant's death. Dr. Martinez gave this to me sealed at Christopher's request about a year ago. She said Christopher was worried about his family questioning his mental capacity if he died unexpectedly. I opened the letter with trembling hands. To whom it may concern, Christopher Grant was my patient for 8 years until his death. During that time, I had numerous opportunities to assess his mental capacity, judgment, and decision-making abilities. Mr. Grant was consistently clear-minded, emotionally stable, and capable of making informed decisions about his personal and financial affairs. In the months before his death, Mr. Grant specifically discussed his estate planning decisions with me, expressing concerns that his family might question his mental capacity if they disagreed with his choices. He was adamant that his financial arrangements were made freely and represented his true wishes for his wife's protection and security. I can state without hesitation that Christopher Grant was mentally competent and acted of his own free will in all financial and legal decisions he made during the time I knew him. Tom had one more document, a video recording on his phone that Christopher had made 6 months before his death. He asked me to film this and keep it safe, Tom explained as he set up his phone. He said he wanted there to be no question about his intentions if his family ever tried to challenge your ownership of your assets. In the video, Christopher sat in Tom's living room, speaking directly to the camera with the same gentle but determined voice I remembered so well. "My name is Christopher Grant, and I'm making this recording on March 15th to document my true feelings about my financial arrangements and my family situation. I want there to be no doubt about my intentions or my mental state. Over the past several years, I have transferred substantial assets to my wife, Melody Grant, including our family home and investment accounts. These transfers were made freely, without coercion, and represent my deliberate choice to protect my wife from potential interference by my extended family. I love my wife completely and trust her judgment in all matters. She has never asked me for money, never pressured me to change my financial arrangements, and has always been a full partner in our marriage. Any suggestion that she has manipulated or controlled me is false and insulting to both of us. My relationship with my birth family has been complicated by their disapproval of my marriage and their expectation that they should have input into my personal decisions. I have made it clear to them that my wife is my priority and my partner, and that she will inherit everything I own because that is what I want. If something happens to me, and my family attempts to challenge Melody's ownership of our assets, or suggests that she doesn't deserve what I've given her, I want this recording to serve as proof of my true feelings. Melody deserves everything I've given her and more. She is my family now, and protecting her is the most important thing I can do with the wealth I inherited. The recording was dated and time-stamped, with Tom providing verbal confirmation of the date and circumstances. It was legally admissible evidence of Christopher's mental state and true intentions. I looked at Tom through tears. He really thought of everything. He loved you, Melody. And he knew his family well enough to predict exactly what they'd try to do. Tom gathered the documents carefully. I have copies of all of this, and I've already shared everything with Ms. Chen. If Christopher's family wants to question his mental capacity or claim you manipulated him, they'll have to deal with documented evidence from multiple independent sources. Will you testify if it comes to that? Absolutely. And so will Dr. Martinez, and probably half a dozen other people who knew Christopher well enough to understand his real feelings about his family. Tom stood up and gave me a long hug. You're not alone in this, Melody. Christopher made sure of that. That afternoon, I called 3 other friends who'd been part of our regular social circle. Each of them had similar stories about Christopher's frustration with his family's treatment of me, and each of them was willing to provide written statements supporting my account of our marriage and his intentions. By evening, I had a file full of witness statements, documented conversations, medical opinions, and video testimony, all supporting the same narrative. Christopher had loved me, trusted me, and deliberately protected me from his family's interference. Far from being a victim of manipulation, he had been the architect of his own estate planning strategy. The Grants could threaten me with legal action, question my character, and claim I'd stolen what belonged to them. But they'd have to do it in the face of overwhelming evidence that Christopher had given me everything willingly and with full knowledge of exactly who he was protecting me from. I called Ms. Chen to update her on what Tom had shared. Mrs. Grant, this changes everything. With this level of documentation, any legal challenge they might file becomes not just frivolous, but potentially sanctionable. We can now prove that any claims about manipulation or coercion are false. What's our next step? We take the offensive. Tomorrow, we send them a comprehensive response that includes excerpts from this evidence. We make it clear that continuing their harassment will result in both civil and criminal consequences. And we give them one final opportunity to walk away before we destroy them completely. It was time to show the Grants that their golden boy had been smarter than they'd ever imagined, and that I was stronger than they'd ever believed. Ms. Chen worked through the weekend to prepare what she called the nuclear option, a comprehensive legal response that would end the Grants' harassment permanently or escalate the situation to criminal prosecution. Monday morning, she called me to her office to review the documents before they were served. Mrs. Grant, what we're sending them today is not just a cease and desist letter. It's a formal legal brief that demonstrates the complete futility of any action they might take against you, combined with evidence of their own criminal exposure. She handed me a thick document titled Legal Brief in Response to Invalid Claims Against Property of Melody Grant. The brief was devastating in its thoroughness. The first section demolished their property claims with surgical precision. It included copies of the original transfer documents, the recorded deed, 5 years of property tax payments in my name alone, and documentation that Christopher had full legal capacity when he made the transfers. The brief cited specific case law showing that completed gifts of real property could not be revoked or challenged after the fact, and noted that any claims against the transfers were barred by the statute of limitations. The second section was even more powerful. It included excerpts from Tom's documented conversations, Dr. Martinez's letter, and still images from Christopher's video testimony. The message was clear: any claim that Christopher had been manipulated or coerced was not just false, but demonstrably false. But the third section was what made this document truly devastating. Ms. Chen had worked with Marcus Webb to document the Grants' financial crimes in language that would be unmistakable to any law enforcement officer who read it. Kevin Grant has engaged in a pattern of financial misconduct, including embezzlement of business funds, fraudulent transfer of assets to avoid creditors, and tax evasion through unreported income, the brief stated. Patricia Grant has participated in these activities by accepting transferred assets with knowledge of their fraudulent nature and by making false statements to financial institutions. Janet Grant has committed bankruptcy fraud by failing to report income and by concealing assets from the bankruptcy court. Each allegation was supported by specific evidence, bank records, court filings, tax documents, and surveillance photographs. The brief made it clear that continuing their harassment of me would result in this evidence being forwarded to appropriate law enforcement agencies. The final section was my favorite part. It included a detailed accounting of Christopher's estate and my current financial position, making it clear that I was financially secure and had no need or desire to negotiate with them about anything. Furthermore, the brief stated, Mrs. Grant's financial independence, combined with the overwhelming evidence of her legal ownership of all disputed assets, demonstrates that she has no incentive to engage in settlement discussions or to consider any arrangement that would benefit the Grant family financially. Ms. Chen had also prepared a companion document, a formal complaint to the State Attorney General's office detailing the Grant family's financial crimes and requesting a criminal investigation. This complaint would be filed immediately if they continued their harassment. The beauty of this approach, Ms. Chen explained, is that we're not making threats. We're simply documenting facts and explaining consequences. If they choose to continue their illegal behavior, the consequences will follow naturally. The documents were served by a professional process server who found Kevin at a construction site, Patricia at her home, and Janet at Kevin's office where she was supposedly unemployed. Each of them received identical packages containing the legal brief, the criminal complaint, and a cover letter from Ms. Chen explaining that they had 48 hours to cease all contact with me or face immediate criminal prosecution. The response was swift and exactly what we'd expected. Kevin called first, his voice shaking with rage. You have no idea what you've just done, Melody. That legal brief is full of lies and fabrications, and we're going to sue your lawyer for defamation. Kevin, everything in that brief is documented with evidence. If you think it's defamatory, file a lawsuit. I'm sure the discovery process will be very interesting. You think you're so smart with your fancy lawyers and your private investigators. But you made one mistake, you declared war on people who have nothing left to lose. The threat was clear, but I was ready for it. Kevin, I'm recording this conversation, and I've already filed for a restraining order against you. If you contact me again or make any more threats, you'll be arrested. He hung up without another word. Patricia's call came an hour later, her tone a mixture of fury and desperation. Melody, that legal document you sent is the most vicious, vindictive thing I've ever seen. How dare you threaten my family with criminal prosecution over a simple property dispute? It's not a property dispute, Patricia. You have no legal claim to my property, and your attempts to take it constitute harassment and potentially extortion. Extortion? We're trying to preserve Christopher's legacy and protect family assets from his wife, who he chose to give them to. Patricia, everything in that brief is true, and you know it. Kevin's business is built on embezzlement and fraud. You've been helping him hide assets from creditors. Janet's been committing bankruptcy fraud. These aren't accusations, they're documented facts. Patricia's voice cracked. We're family, Melody. Christopher would never want us to destroy each other like this. Christopher wanted to protect me from exactly what you're doing. That's why he transferred everything to my name 5 years ago, because he knew you'd try to take it if you could. Please, just think about what you're doing. If Kevin goes to prison, dozens of families will lose their incomes. If I lose my house, I'll have nowhere to go. If Janet's bankruptcy case collapses, she'll never recover financially. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. But then I remembered her cold smile when she'd handed me that eviction notice, her casual cruelty when she'd suggested I was a gold digger, her coordinated campaign to break me down and steal everything Christopher had left me. Patricia, you should have thought about those consequences before you decided to steal my house. You had choices. You could have asked for help. You could have been honest about your financial problems. You could have treated me like family instead of like an enemy. But instead, you chose to threaten me, harass me, and try to intimidate me into giving up everything my husband left me. Melody, please, the choice is still yours, Patricia. Stop contacting me, stop making claims about my property, and accept that Christopher's inheritance belongs to me. If you do that, I'll be content to live my life and let you live yours. But if you continue this harassment, I'll make sure all three of you face the full consequences of your criminal behavior. I hung up and immediately called Ms. Chen to report both conversations. She made notes and assured me that the criminal complaint would be filed the next morning if I received any further contact from them. That evening, I sat in Christopher's office, looking through the window at the yard he'd never gotten to landscape, feeling something I hadn't experienced since his death, peace. For months, I'd been reacting to their attacks, defending myself against their claims, trying to prove that I deserved what Christopher had given me. But now I understood that I'd been fighting the wrong battle. I didn't need to prove I deserved Christopher's love or his inheritance. I didn't need to justify my marriage or defend my character against their accusations. I didn't need their approval or their acceptance. I just needed them to leave me alone. And now I had the power to make sure they did. Tomorrow, if they were smart, they would disappear from my life forever. If they weren't smart, they would discover that Christopher had given me much more than financial security. He'd given me the strength to destroy anyone who tried to take away what we'd built together. The 48-hour deadline passed in silence. For 3 peaceful days, I believed the Grants had finally understood reality and chosen to retreat. I was wrong. Thursday morning, I found Kevin's truck parked across from my house. He wasn't hiding, sitting in the driver's seat, drinking coffee, staring at my door. When I looked out, he raised his coffee cup in mock salute. I called Ms. Chen immediately. "They're violating the restraining order." A sheriff's deputy arrived and approached Kevin's truck. After a brief conversation, Kevin drove away. The deputy explained he'd been on public property, technically not violating the order, but had been warned about surveillance behavior. An hour later, I discovered what Kevin had really been doing. My mailbox had been broken into, several pieces missing. The post office confirmed someone had tried to redirect my mail to a downtown P.O. box. The form was rejected because it wasn't properly notarized, the clerk explained, but someone definitely tried to redirect your mail illegally. The escalation continued. My bank called about unusual account activity, someone claiming to be me, trying to access account information. Every financial institution had similar stories, calls and visits from people claiming to represent me, fishing for asset information. That evening, my neighbor Mrs. Patterson called. A woman came to my door claiming to be from social services, asking about your mental state and whether you seemed capable of living alone. The description matched Janet. They were building a case that I was mentally incompetent. Tom Bradley warned me they'd contacted Christopher's friends with similar fishing expeditions. Janet called asking if Christopher had ever expressed doubts about your relationship. I told her Christopher's biggest concern was protecting you from his manipulative family. The most brazen escalation came the next morning. I woke to find a "for sale" sign planted in my yard, complete with realtor contact information and a below-market price. The confused realtor explained Kevin had contacted her, claiming to represent the family estate for a quick sale. He said you were just a tenant moving out voluntarily due to financial pressures. 2 other agents had similar stories, different family members, different explanations, all claiming authority to sell my property. Ms. Chen called with an update. They've moved well beyond harassment into criminal fraud territory. I'm filing the criminal complaint this afternoon and requesting arrest warrants. That afternoon, I looked at the fake "for sale" sign still planted in my yard, thinking about how far the Grants had fallen from their position of assumed authority. They'd started believing they could intimidate me through legal threats. When that failed, they escalated to harassment and character assassination. Now they were committing multiple felonies in desperate attempts to steal what they couldn't claim legally. But they still didn't understand. I wasn't just Christopher's widow clinging to memories. I was the legal owner of substantial assets, with excellent representation and documented evidence of both my rights and their crimes. Tomorrow, they would discover that their criminal behavior had consequences they'd never imagined. The war was almost over. And I had won completely. Friday morning arrived with the sound of sirens. I watched from my kitchen window as 3 sheriff's department vehicles pulled into my driveway, followed by Ms. Chen's car. The moment I'd been building toward for weeks had finally arrived. Ms. Chen knocked on my door carrying a briefcase and wearing the satisfied expression of a lawyer who was about to deliver decisive victory. "Mrs. Grant, the arrest warrants have been issued. The sheriff's department is here to remove the fraudulent for sale sign as evidence, and then we're going to execute the warrants." The deputies were professional and efficient, photographing the sign from multiple angles before carefully removing it and placing it in an evidence bag. The lead deputy, Sergeant Morrison, explained the process. "Ma'am, we have warrants for Kevin Grant, Patricia Grant, and Janet Grant on charges of harassment, attempted fraud, mail fraud conspiracy, and filing false documents. We'll be executing these warrants this morning, and all 3 subjects will be taken into custody for booking and arraignment." I felt a strange mixture of relief and sadness. This was the end Christopher had foreseen, the consequence he'd tried to protect me from having to witness. But it was also justice for months of harassment and the vindication of everything he'd done to protect me. Ms. Chen opened her briefcase. "Mrs. Grant, before the arrests are made, I want to show you one final document. This morning, I received a call from Patricia Grant's attorney. Apparently she finally hired legitimate legal counsel. She handed me a letter on law firm letterhead. Dear Ms. Chen, this firm has been retained to represent Patricia Grant in the matter of property claims against Melody Grant. After reviewing the documentation provided by our client and conducting our own legal research, we must advise Mrs. Grant that she has no viable legal claim to any property currently owned by Mrs. Melody Grant. Furthermore, We have advised our client that continued pursuit of these claims could result in sanctions for filing frivolous lawsuits and potential criminal liability for harassment and fraud. We strongly recommend that Mrs. Grant cease all contact with Mrs. Melody Grant immediately and seek financial counseling to address her legitimate financial difficulties through legal means. Please be advised that this firm will not be representing Mrs. Grant in any action against Mrs. Melody Grant, as we do not file lawsuits without legal merit. I looked up at Ms. Chen. Even her own lawyer is telling her to stop. That's right. And this letter will be very useful evidence that they knew their claims were baseless but continued their harassment anyway. It goes directly to the question of criminal intent. Sergeant Morrison's radio crackled with updates from the other arrest teams. Ma'am, we've taken Kevin Grant into custody at his construction site. The other teams are en route to arrest Patricia and Janet Grant now. Within an hour, all 3 members of the Grant family were in custody, booked on multiple felony charges, and facing the immediate reality that their financial crimes had consequences they'd never anticipated. But the most satisfying moment came that afternoon, when Ms. Chen called to report on the arraignment hearing. Mrs. Grant, you're not going to believe what happened in court. When the judge read the charges and the evidence against them, Patricia Grant broke down completely and confessed to everything. Ms. Chen explained that Patricia had admitted to orchestrating the harassment campaign, acknowledged that they had no legal claim to my property, and revealed the full extent of their financial desperation. She told the judge that they owed over $600,000 in combined debts, that Kevin's business was days away from complete collapse, and that they saw your inheritance as their only chance to avoid financial ruin. Ms. Chen sounded almost incredulous. She actually said in open court that they knew they had no legal right to your property but hoped they could pressure you into sharing it out of family obligation. What about Kevin and Janet? Kevin tried to maintain that they were just looking out for family interests, but when the prosecutor presented evidence of the attempted mail fraud and the fake real estate listing, he realized how serious his situation was. Janet's bankruptcy fraud charges are being handled separately, but her lawyer is already discussing a plea agreement. The judge had set bail at $25,000 each, which none of them could afford given their financial situation. They would remain in custody until their trial or until they could arrange plea agreements. Mrs. Grant, there's one more thing. The prosecutor asked me to tell you that Patricia Grant specifically requested to speak with you. She wants to apologize and ask for your forgiveness. I thought about that request for a long time. Part of me wanted to face Patricia and hear her admit that everything she'd done to me was wrong. But a larger part of me realized that I didn't need her apology to feel vindicated or her forgiveness to move forward. Tell the prosecutor that I declined to meet with her. I have nothing to say to any of them. That evening, I sat in Christopher's office and pulled out the original property deed that showed my name as the sole owner. For the first time since his death, I really looked at the document not as a legal shield but as what it truly was, Christopher's final love letter to me. The deed was dated 5 years ago, notarized and recorded with careful precision. But at the bottom, in the margin where most people would never look, Christopher had written a small note in his distinctive handwriting, "For Melody, so you'll never have to ask anyone's permission to be happy." I held the deed and cried for the first time in weeks, not tears of grief or anger, but tears of gratitude for a man who'd loved me enough to see into the future and protect me from dangers I'd never imagined. Christopher had known his family would try to destroy me after his death. He'd known they would question my worth, challenge my rights, and attempt to take away everything we'd built together. But he'd also known that I was stronger than they realized, and he'd given me every weapon I'd need to defend myself. The house was truly mine now, not just legally but emotionally. I was no longer Christopher's widow clinging to his memory, I was Melody Grant, homeowner, and I'd earned the right to live here through my own strength and determination. Tomorrow, I would start planning the rest of my life. I'd finish the landscaping project Christopher had started. I'd redecorate the rooms that still felt frozen in time. I'd invite friends over for dinner and host the kind of gatherings we'd always talked about but never quite gotten around to. Most importantly, I'd live without fear, without worrying about phone calls or threatening letters or people who thought they could take away what didn't belong to them. Christopher had given me security, but I'd given myself something even more valuable, the knowledge that I could fight for what mattered and win. The Grants spent 3 days in jail before Kevin's wife scraped together bail money. Their release came with strict conditions: no contact with me, no approach to my property, and mandatory probation check-ins. The first violation came within hours. Kevin's wife Sandra called, voice shaking. "Melody, please don't hang up. Kevin doesn't know I'm calling. I need you to understand, Kevin's been lying to everyone about how bad things really are." Sandra explained Kevin had hidden their financial problems for over a year, even forging her signature on loan documents. I found papers after his arrest. He had fake documents claiming Christopher promised him the house. They're completely fabricated. She agreed to provide the forged documents to Ms. Chen and give a statement about Kevin's planning and deception, but Kevin discovered Sandra's cooperation quickly. The next morning, she called from a hospital emergency room. Kevin found out I talked to you. He got very angry. I needed medical attention. Kevin was back in custody within hours, domestic violence and bail violation. This time, no bail. That afternoon, Janet appeared at my door, crying and desperate. I know I'm violating the restraining order, but I need to tell you something before they arrest me again. Against better judgment, I let her inside while calling Ms. Chen. Janet poured out a confession that was shocking and pathetic. We planned this before Christopher even died. Mom researched inheritance laws, consulted attorneys, developed what she called the campaign to convince you to give up voluntarily. Janet handed me a manila envelope containing Patricia's handwritten strategy notes, drafted phone scripts, fake documents Kevin had prepared, and surveillance notes about my routines. Mom was convinced that enough pressure would break you down. She said most widows were too emotional to fight back effectively. Janet looked up with something like respect. She was wrong about you. Why are you telling me this? Because I'm tired of Mom's schemes. Because Kevin's violence showed me how far this family will go. And because I actually liked you, Melody. You didn't deserve what we did. Janet stood to leave but turned back. Christopher knew. He figured out Mom was planning something, and that's why he made that video with Tom. He wanted you to have every weapon you'd need. After Janet left, I sat with her confession and Patricia's planning documents, finally understanding the full scope. This hadn't been spontaneous family grief, it had been a calculated campaign to destroy me psychologically and steal everything Christopher had given me, but it had also been a catastrophic miscalculation by people who'd never bothered to understand who I really was. Ms. Chen called that evening. Janet's been arrested for violating the restraining order, but she's agreed to cooperate fully in exchange for a reduced sentence. With her testimony and documents, we can pursue conspiracy charges against all three. The war was over. I had won completely. I asked Sandra to hold on while I called Ms. Chen on another line. Ms. Chen advised me to keep Sandra talking and to record the conversation if possible. Sandra, are you willing to provide copies of those documents to my attorney? Yes. Melody, I know my husband has done terrible things to you, but I need you to know that not everyone in this family supported what he was doing. I tried to tell him to leave you alone, but he said you didn't deserve what Christopher left you because you weren't real family. Sandra agreed to meet with Ms. Chen the next day to provide the forged documents and to give a statement about Kevin's planning and deception. Her cooperation would provide crucial evidence for the criminal prosecution, but Kevin discovered Sandra's betrayal quickly. The next morning, she called again, this time from a hospital emergency room. Melody, Kevin found out I talked to you. He got very angry. I'm okay, but I needed medical attention, and I'm scared to go home. I immediately called Ms. Chen, who contacted the domestic violence unit of the sheriff's department. By noon, Kevin was back in custody on charges of domestic violence and violation of his bail conditions. This time, there would be no bail. The afternoon brought an even more dramatic development. Janet appeared at my front door, but instead of her usual hostility, she looked broken and desperate. She was crying before I even opened the door fully. Melody, please, I know I'm not supposed to be here, but I need to tell you something before they arrest me again. Janet, you're violating the restraining order just by being here. I know. I don't care anymore. They're going to send me to prison anyway. She held up a manila envelope. This contains every document, every plan, every conversation we had about taking your house. I want you to have it. Against my better judgment, I let her inside while I called Ms. Chen to report the contact. Janet sat at my kitchen table and poured out a confession that was both shocking and pathetic. Melody, we planned all of this before Christopher even died. Mom has been watching his health for years, hoping something would happen that would give us access to his money. When he had that minor chest pain episode 6 months before he died, she started researching inheritance laws and property rights. Janet explained that Patricia had consulted with several attorneys about challenging Christopher's estate planning, but every lawyer had told her the same thing: the property transfers were legal and irrevocable. That's when Mom decided we had to convince you to give it up voluntarily. She researched psychological pressure tactics, studied cases where families had successfully contested inheritances, and developed what she called the campaign. The manila envelope contained Patricia's handwritten notes detailing their strategy. Initial legal intimidation, escalating harassment, character assassination, and finally criminal fraud if necessary. There were drafted scripts for phone calls, copies of the fake documents Kevin had prepared, and even surveillance notes about my daily routines. Mom was convinced that if we applied enough pressure, you'd eventually break down and agree to some kind of settlement. She said most widows were too emotional and too weak to fight back effectively. Janet looked up at me with something that might have been respect. She was wrong about you. You're a lot stronger than any of us realized. Why? Are you telling me this now, Janet? Because I'm tired of being part of Mom's schemes. Because Kevin's violence against Sandra showed me how far this family is willing to go to get what it wants. And because, she paused, struggling with the words. Because I actually liked you, Melody. You were always kind to me, even when I was horrible to you. You didn't deserve what we did. Janet stood up to leave, but turned back at the door. There's one more thing you should know. Christopher knew. He figured out that Mom was planning something, and that's why he made that video with Tom. He told Tom that if anything happened to him, Mom would try to destroy you, and he wanted to make sure you had every weapon you'd need to fight back. After Janet left, I sat with her confession and Patricia's planning documents, finally understanding the full scope of what I'd been fighting against. This hadn't been a spontaneous family dispute over inheritance rights. It had been a calculated campaign designed to break me down psychologically and steal everything Christopher had given me, but it had also been something else, a catastrophic miscalculation by people who'd never bothered to understand who I really was. Patricia had seen a grieving widow who could be intimidated into submission. Christopher had seen a strong woman who would fight for what mattered to her. Christopher had been right. That evening, Ms. Chen called with the final update. Mrs. Grant, Janet Grant has been arrested for violating the restraining order, but she's also agreed to cooperate fully with the prosecution in exchange for a reduced sentence. With her testimony and the documents she provided, we now have enough evidence to pursue conspiracy charges against all three of them. What happens next? Next, they face the consequences of underestimating you. The prosecutor is confident that all three will accept plea agreements rather than risk trial with the evidence we have. Kevin will likely serve 2 to 3 years in prison. Patricia and Janet will probably get probation and restitution orders, but their financial lives are essentially over. I hung up the phone and walked through my house, thinking about how much had changed since that morning 3 weeks ago when Patricia had knocked on my door with her eviction notice. I was no longer the lost widow who'd been paralyzed by grief and shock. I was someone who'd learned to investigate, to plan, to fight strategically, and to win decisively against people who thought they could destroy me. Tomorrow, I would start building the life Christopher had wanted me to have, secure, independent, and free from people who thought they could take away what didn't belong to them. But tonight, I would simply enjoy the silence of a house where the phone wouldn't ring with threats, where I could sleep without worrying about what attack would come next, where I could finally begin to heal from Christopher's death without having to fight for the right to grieve in peace. The war was over. And I had won it completely. The final court hearing took place on a gray Tuesday morning 2 months after the Grants had first tried to evict me. I sat with Ms. Chen, watching as the 3 people who'd tried to destroy my life faced consequences. Kevin appeared in orange jumpsuit and handcuffs. His domestic violence charges added to fraud and harassment charges made his attorney look defeated. The prosecutor read the litany: embezzlement, mail fraud, attempted real estate fraud, filing false documents, harassment, and domestic violence. Kevin's plea agreement: 3 years in state prison, $15,000 restitution for my legal fees, permanent restraining order. When the judge asked if he understood, Kevin mumbled agreement without looking up. Patricia appeared in simple black dress, looking frail and defeated. Her plea avoided prison in exchange for full restitution and cooperation. Mrs. Grant, the judge said, looking directly at Patricia, you orchestrated harassment against your daughter-in-law that was both cruel and criminal. You used grief and desperation to justify stealing from someone who'd done nothing wrong except marry into your family. Patricia's agreement: $25,000 restitution, 500 hours community service, 2 years supervised probation, financial counseling, no contact with me for 10 years. The judge's final comment was most satisfying: the evidence shows your daughter-in-law's ownership was completely legal and you knew this from the beginning. Your attempts to claim otherwise constitute not just harassment, but fundamental rejection of your son's right to make his own decisions about his legacy. You should be ashamed. Janet's case was handled quickly. Her bankruptcy fraud resolved. Separately, her cooperation earned leniency: 1 year probation, 200 hours community service, $5,000 restitution. When all plea agreements were accepted, the judge called me forward for a victim impact statement. Your Honor, these people didn't just try to steal my house. They tried to steal my right to grieve in peace, tried to convince me I didn't deserve my husband's love or legacy, tried to make me feel guilty for accepting gifts given freely and legally. I looked directly at Patricia. But they failed. They Failed because my husband was smarter than they realized and because I was stronger than they assumed. Christopher protected me even after death, and I protected what he gave me. I don't want revenge. I want justice. Justice means they face consequences for their crimes and I'm free to live without fear of harassment. Walking out of the courthouse, I felt strange mixture of relief and sadness. Kevin would spend 3 years in prison, his business permanently closed. Patricia had lost her house to legal fees, living in a small apartment with destroyed reputation. Janet had declared bankruptcy. Again, working retail in a neighboring town, but I realized I felt sorry for them without regretting fighting back. They had choices: ask for help, be honest about problems, treat me like family. Instead, they chose harassment and intimidation. The consequences were natural results of their decisions, not cruel punishment I'd inflicted. That evening, Tom Bradley called. Christopher would be so proud. You fought for yourself exactly as he hoped. I fought for what he gave me. But you're right, he would be proud. The war was over. And I had won. 6 months later, I was planting roses in Christopher's memorial garden when I found his final surprise. Hidden beneath a loose stone was a waterproof box containing a letter dated 1 week before his death. My dearest Melody, if you're reading this, I've died and my family tried to take what I gave you. You fought back and won, because that's who you are, stronger than you think, braver than you feel, more deserving than you believe. I have one final request: don't spend your life protecting what I gave you. Use it. Build something beautiful with it. You were the best part of my life. Now go be the best part of your own. Inside the safe in his office, I found a ring I'd never seen, simple gold with an inscription: to Melody, my partner in everything that matters. There was also a business plan for a non-profit providing legal assistance to widows facing estate disputes, plus a $100,000 account for whatever dream you haven't told me about yet. Within 3 months, the Christopher Grant Foundation for Widow Advocacy was operational. We provided free legal consultations and support for women facing family harassment. Our first client was Sandra, Kevin's ex-wife. Our second was a young mother fighting in-laws over life insurance. Each success felt like vindication of Christopher's faith in my strength. A year later, I received an unexpected letter from Patricia. Working at a food bank for community service, she'd helped another harassed widow and given her our foundation's contact information. I told her about what I did to you and how wrong I was, Patricia wrote. She said you helped her keep her home and get a restraining order. She said you probably saved her life. I can't undo what I did, but seeing you turn your pain into help for others has made me understand. Christopher was right to trust you with everything, because you've used it to build something better than any of us imagined. I never responded, but kept the letter as a reminder that people can change, even when it's too late to matter. 2 years after Christopher's death, a magazine featured me in an article about women turning tragedy into activism. When asked how I found strength to fight back, I said, I didn't find strength, I discovered it was already there. My husband saw it before I did. What would you tell other women facing similar situations? Love isn't just what someone gives you, it's what they make possible for you. Christopher didn't just leave me money and property. He left me tools and confidence to protect myself and build something meaningful. The article brought dozens of emails from women sharing their own stories, each reminding me that Christopher's greatest gift wasn't the house or money, it was believing I was strong enough to handle whatever came next. 3 years later, I still live in our house, but it's transformed. Rooms are brighter, filled with friends and the sound of women learning to advocate for themselves. Christopher's memorial garden blooms every spring on our anniversary. I wear his ring daily, not as symbol of loss but as reminder of partnership. That gave me courage to build something beautiful from something broken. Sometimes people ask about remarrying. I tell them Christopher didn't prepare me to live in the past, he prepared me to live fully in whatever future I choose. That future is still being written, but every chapter begins with the same truth: I am enough, exactly as I am. I deserve the love I was given and the life I've built. And no one gets to take that away. Christopher knew that. And finally, so do I.